Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today. Can everyone hear me? Yep, okay. I hope you find this discussion both useful and interesting. Just to briefly introduce myself, I lead the AML Modeling and Advanced Data Insights Group at Capital One. So the teams that I lead essentially build, defend, and maintain the surveillance models that the bank uses to meet our BSA and Patriot Act obligations. I'm a 20-year veteran of building and applying statistics to risk management problems. That is an old-fashioned way of saying I did data science before it was actually referred to as data science. And almost equally as long working through the nuances of explaining these solutions to various internal and external stakeholders. Much like Grace and Rick Hamilton's discussions yesterday, I'm going to be focusing on the process of why AI and machine learning matters and how to get buy-in from all the various stakeholders that you generally need.
Switch me.
Better? Better.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm going to be, like I was saying, I'm going to focus on the process of how to explain the whole process behind implementation of innovations and new models. You know, I like to say that there's an art and science to what we do, and this discussion will focus a little bit more on the art part, as I like to say. First, I'd like to take a poll just to see, by a show of hands, how many of you have to go through an extra level of governance when deploying models, either through model validation or having to socialize with a regulator? Okay, about half of you. So I guess the other half of you do not, so, you know, thank yourselves for that, because there is a whole process that goes behind all the things you have to do with your regulator when you're socializing changes and when you're really implementing new things. So how do you incorporate innovation into highly regulated areas of the bank? Well, it's no surprise with all of the news of fines and written agreements, AML, specifically anti-money laundering, is one of the most highly regulated areas of the bank. Not the only regulated area of the bank, but very, very regulated. So many of the examples that I'm going to be drawing on today are from AML, but the points today will really resonate in any area that's highly regulated. I think that we'll all agree that AI and machine learning has processes that definitely make our business processes more efficient, better governed, and from an operational standpoint, the impact can be very, very large. Otherwise, none of us would really be here. Compliance and BSA AML compliance specifically is one of the most expensive areas of risk management at any financial institution. It's also one of the most difficult to articulate business value or propositions on, because how do you really put a dollar amount on good governance and the avoidance of MRAs? So I know a lot of banks who have been hit with fines and written agreements certainly have to dump a lot of money into their programs, and they can sort of articulate what that cost is, but I would argue that really brings a program up to what it probably should have been to begin with. So how to convince regulators, once you've put in a program, to change it and be more efficient and actually drives greater risk management is something everyone in this area really has to consistently think about. In 2018, the powers that be, being the collective regulatory bodies of the banking world, issued this joint statement. It is a beautifully vague statement, but bold in the sense that it's gone further than any other statement previously. And what you'll notice is that the general statement uses the word augment, which generally implies that you want to make your program better, but they don't really provide guidelines how. Now, in the defense of all the regulators, every bank is different on the maturity curve. So when it comes to adopting new technologies and innovation in general, it's very hard for them to provide a general guideline depending on your bank. So when we break down what this really means to regulated entities, there is a very basic risk that regulators are trying to ensure is mitigated. And that's the evidence of risk management decisions and risk-based decisions, which currently, if you look at the current regimes, are very timely and manual due to human-driven processes. So there are definitely ways that we can improve these processes, incorporating technology to either speed up or reduce the amount of manual work required to meet regulator expectations and obligations. Regulators, in my experience, definitely understand that the world is changing. And the use of new and innovative methods and technologies is definitely inevitable. But what most institutions see, and regulators as a result, see the final business value without usually full consideration of the whole life cycle of risk management that you need to incorporate. And especially with legacy processes, I mean, good risk management generally includes good governance. So I think Rick Hamilton talked about this yesterday, but the detection of financial crime activity is surrounded by human-driven processes. That usually means gathering evidence on a particular risk, writing a narrative, downloading data, doing some sort of analysis, and then submitting a SAR report. A good portion of this whole process can be automated by RPA, models, NLP, I mean, you name it. You have different parts of that whole process that have now been taken over by some level of the machine. So the capabilities and the opportunity is there, but what regulators are most interested in knowing is, how do you know it's working? What occurs if there's a breakdown? Who checks if the process is working properly? Is there bias in the process? I mean, I could definitely go on, but really from a regulatory standpoint, if you think about it, all of these things need to be considered, articulated, and you need to have a plan for them. So I think that really lends to the whole process behind what you're trying to do. And I've heard regulators, especially recently, say, if it's not broken, why fix it? And my viewpoint on that is that it's not just about building that mousetrap, but it's about how many mice you can catch and whether or not it's efficient. So if we consider the use case of machine learning to replace legacy monitoring, and specifically in the AML sense, just to give everyone the same understanding, because not everyone here probably works in financial crime, from a traditional standpoint, AML is not all that sophisticated when it comes to catching bad guys. There are a bunch of if-then-else rules that really detects outlying behavior or really outlying activity for customers. And a human being reviews that activity and determines whether or not an actual AML risk occurs. So this leads to risk mitigation, which is generally very easily understood, but very, very costly. I mean, there is a high number of false positives. I mean, the best analogy that I could use is that you have a fishing net, which is so huge that you throw it out into the ocean and you get not just the fish that you want, but a whole bunch of other things with it. And what machine learning allows you to do is really do long line fishing, but in instead of just one pole, you're using hundreds of poles at the same time. So certainly there are more precise ways to detect this risk, which in turn, when you're developing this, it really does lead to a cross-functional group, or at least collaboration with other folks, both internally and externally, to make it successful. So there are three aspects of cross-collaboration, which I'm going to cover today. One is model development, or what the new innovation is, communication with external stakeholders, and change management. So ideation is definitely step one. But just because you have a great idea doesn't necessarily mean that everyone will agree. And you certainly need to convince everyone that via a grounded analysis, that a new idea or model will provide a lift. So once you've figured out to take it from soups to nuts in terms of what you're going to do, you still need to describe this in business terms. So the ratios which I have up here from building to socialization will certainly be different depending on whether you're responsible for the whole process or you are responsible for just part of it. And I'm talking about this from the point of view of being responsible for the entire process. So part of this is that socialization needs to occur early and often. And how many times have we heard of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing? Well, a lot of this has to do with governance, engaging people early, understanding your subject matter domain to the point where whatever model or innovation you're pushing forward has solved the right problem. So setting up regular governance meetings for updates really avoids a lot of the pitfalls that come with that. So you really do want to do this before you start allocating resources to build something. In developing an MVP, or minimum viable product, generally AI and ML models face departures on a couple of different areas. First is risk identification. Second is model data preparation. Those differ a little bit from legacy processes. Algorithm selection, model tuning, and model implementation. Model implementation depends on how you actually implement your model into your system or whether or not the model is the system itself. So having a plan and understanding of what each of these considerations are really allows you to break down the problem into manageable pieces. It also allows you to share successes and drawbacks and allows the whole team to help problem solve and makes everyone feel as though they're contributing. It also helps you define well thought out success criteria and realistic KPIs. These are all things leading up to one of the main takeaways of this talk, which is credibility. Even if this is your first time or your 100th time engaging with regulators on a model or new process, it revolves around whether or not you're doing things for the right reason and why you were doing something. The how and the what really at the end of the day doesn't matter, but you want to be able to convince others that you know what you're talking about. And this process, or at least some level of this process, will one, help demonstrate that you know what you're talking about, two, show your work, and then three, course correct before things go off the rails. So these are all things at the end of the day that the regulator or other stakeholders care about from a risk management perspective. As much as we care about how we actually get somewhere, what kind of algorithms you use, whether or not your data is well populated, if you don't have a well thought out sort of plan on how to attack things that could go wrong, those are generally what the regulator cares about. So how do you communicate with the regulators with the idea of having some level of credibility? So these are usually the items that I would consider, or the general algorithm that I have found that works over time. Early communication is definitely one of them, which you don't want to engage with your regulator 2 weeks before you're launching something. That is a recipe for disaster. Aligning on your terminology. There's enough times I've had discussions with a regulator on they think self-learning models are what you're trying to do, which sometimes, at least from a regulatory standpoint, is not what you're trying to do. So really aligning on what the terminology means. And then obviously providing overview and conveying intent. Why are you doing what you're doing and how are you doing it? And then finally, monitoring plan. What are you actually going to do from a post-implementation perspective? There's been a lot of discussion, especially in AML, around below-the-line testing. How do you do continuous, ongoing improvements? Those are all considerations that you're definitely going to need to do. So really, if you familiarize reviewing groups with this early and often, you avoid a ton of feedback and back and forth at the end. Too many institutions don't think about how to drive change and simply implement the change. This is another huge ingredient for disaster. I mean, UAT, understanding the end user experience, are extremely important considerations. And, I went to many talks here about customer experience, and that's exactly what this is kind of talking about. When implementing AI and machine learning, I mean, that couldn't be more true as a practitioner. If you build a model that no one actually uses, or they don't absorb the reason that you're doing the change, they will not accept the change. And it's a very simple concept, but a lot of institutions don't do this well. And eventually this will lead to a target operating state where change management and the framework that you're using becomes a part of what you're trying to do. So I think, making this a major consideration in terms of how you're going to institute change is something that more institutions should really, take a lot of time to think about and determine how they're going to do it. So let's recap. So what are the takeaways at the end of the day from this discussion that I've had today? So, I mean, there is a journey that one needs to take, especially when you're working with traditional legacy type processes and moving towards machine learning and innovation. And that could mean from a process perspective, it could mean from a model perspective. And if you think about all the complexities that risk management has and how you navigate using the right planning and collaboration, I think the key here is that you need to be able to communicate with all the groups necessary in order to reach that destination together. And that always makes future deployments a lot easier. And if you look at it from the three areas that I kind of outlined, from model development to early communication with regulators, and obviously change management, I mean, this, again, all of this leads towards credibility to show that you actually know what you're talking about. And if you think about it, I mean, if you go on vacation, for example, and you get a guide, you want the guide that plans ahead, that can kind of navigate through different issues that'll arise, versus the guide that is brand new and doesn't know if things are still open. And this all leads to, hey, you have a plan in place. So these are all the things that essentially from an algorithm or from a process perspective, you're going to want to consider. So I'll end with this. Why does credibility matter? And I think, memes aside, I think we all know about the depositions that Mark Zuckerberg did in front of Congress in terms of just privacy, data matters, and everything else that Facebook really has to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And we all know, as a result of his deposition, how Facebook's credibility really took a hit and is still trying to recover from from that sort of discussion and really performance that he had in front of the regulators. And it's something that even if they come up with the best version of Meta ever going forward, he's still going to need to be able to sell that continuously to audiences and to regulators to ensure that they are not taking advantage of all the data that they have access to. And this is really why credibility at the end of the day is something that you should focus on when you're thinking about how to deploy these types of models. So I think we might have a couple of minutes for questions, I think. So let's see if there are any questions.